Welcome to Raving Ryan. I'm your host, Ryan Anastasio. Today I have a very special guest. He's the chief media correspondent for CNN and host of the Sunday show Reliable Sources. He's also the author of a new book coming out on August 25th, Hoax, Donald Trump, Fox News, and the Dangerous Distortion of Truth. Brian Stelter. Brian, thank you very much for joining me. How are you?
Thank you. Good. How are you?
Yeah, so just first of all, how have you been doing these past several months? You've been living in the epicenter of the crisis in New York City.
Well, certainly March and April feel like history at this point, and it'll be history forever. I think, I'll be telling grandkids about it someday. There are certain memories I think that all New Yorkers will have from March and April of the sirens and of the refrigerated trucks. Outside the hospital where my kids were born, there was a fenced off area with a tent where they were taking in victims. So, I think those elements of the COVID crisis seem already like history as the city starts to open back up, but open up carefully and with an eye toward all of the problems that are happening now in other states. It's a shame that it seems like other cities didn't learn as much from New York as maybe they should have.
Yeah, I'm here in Connecticut also. We've kind of went through the worst of it, but right now the cases have gone down here in this part of the country, but it looks like that's going to change. And it's really just an incredible moment in news, and everything's changed so much. And I want to get into that later, but I want to talk about your career, which is incredible. And here you are, 34 years old, you have your own show on CNN. But you started out as a kid. You were a news junkie like me, always watching some of the greats on television at night, the evening news. And then when you were, I think it was 18, you started your own blog called TV Newser, which kind of followed cable news. It wasn't really a website where you could talk about cable news and learn more about it. And you started that website and it kind of blew up from there. Can you talk about that, your early experience in journalism and creating the blog TV Newser?
Well, it just came from my own obsession, my own passion for TV news. I suppose I was just really curious about the topic, curious about Fox and MSNBC and CNN. I definitely was not trying to get a job in TV because I was already balding. I didn't think there was room for me in television. That's really true. And also because I was working on my high school newspaper and my college newspaper, and I loved print. I loved the newspaper experience. I loved the newspaper newsroom. But I was also curious about TV. So I suppose I was trying to learn about different mediums. I was, on one hand, blogging about TV news. On the other hand, working on my school paper. So I was trying to get different experience in different areas. But like I said, it was all coming out of that obsession with television news.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about the blog specifically? I mean, you were in college, you were very busy, you had your studies, you had the school newspaper, you had your blog, and it was really a huge blog. You had people like Brian Williams, who was the anchor of NBC Nightly News. He was reading your blog regularly.
Yeah, this was in 2004 when the blog launched. This was, kind of post-Iraq invasion, pre-Katrina, in this kind of first term of the Bush administration, heading into the second term of the Bush administration. And, the news cycle was intense at the time. There were questions about Iraq. There were questions, and cable was becoming more and more important. Keith Olbermann was rising at MSNBC. Bill O'Reilly was rising at Fox News. The blog filled a need in the marketplace because there was no obsessive website tracking cable news. There were websites about local news, local TV, and newspapers, and there was Drudge and Romanesco, but there was nothing just about TV news and cable news, really specifically cable news. So that's what I tried to fill in. And because nobody else was doing it, that's why Brian Williams and Greta Van Susteren and Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity all started reading it. Hannity and I struck up a relationship. Tucker and I struck up a relationship. These are people that I'm now covering 16 years later, but they had to read the blog because all of their friends and rivals and haters and competitors were reading the blog. So I think, things like that tend to have a virtuous cycle. It's like a snowball running downhill. You get a few people reading, then a few more, then a few more. You need to get it rolling like that. Fox News took the blog really seriously because for Fox, it was a way to get information out, get their press releases out, get their ratings out. So Fox was the first network feeding me information. which is ironic 16 years later, now that I'm doing a book about them and the Nocturnal level of it. But that was the idea of the blog. And, knowing that the news anchors were reading, that created a responsibility, but I always viewed it as a hobby. I was always just something fun to do. And in retrospect, I wish I had treated it more like a business. I wish I had tried to make a lot of money off it or something, but it was really just a hobby. And of course, it led me to get a job at the New York Times. So, and then CNN. So I suppose the payoff came later.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah, and I want to talk about you going to the New York Times. Very incredible. Right out of college, you got a job as a media reporter, and you went into the New York Times newsroom as probably you were probably the youngest reporter there. What was that experience like, being with all these older reporters and legends in the news business?
A couple of, maybe a week or two or three, a little bit, very early on at the New York Times in the summer of 2007, Gawker, the now debunked, not debunked, the defunct website Gawker, put up an item that said, "We hear that there's a turf war between Brian Stelter and the older reporters." Bill Carter was the senior reporter. He was, the television reporter of all television reporters. And this item was like, is there tension between Brian Stelter and Bill Carter? And there wasn't, not that I knew about, but it was awkward to have those kinds of items written and that kind of speculation happening. I wonder what Bill would say, because now, of course, he is a CNN analyst and he's on my show sometimes. I don't know what he would say about the relationship back then, but here's how I saw it. I got into the New York Times and I was the fourth string quarterback. Like I was the fourth TV reporter on the beat. So I looked around, and again, kind of like my blog, I looked around and said, what can I do that others are not doing? Bill Carter is so great at covering broadcast TV, and Jock is covering broadcast and cable, and Ed is covering Hollywood. What can I cover that they're not doing? And it turned out to be YouTube, and it turned out to be Netflix, and it turned out to be web video wars like Hulu. It turned out that when you go in to try to find what others aren't covering, you sometimes land on the really interesting new thing. And, I'm not claiming that's what I did every day, but when I was successful at the Times, it was because I was looking for those stories, looking for those corners of the world that weren't being covered.
Yeah, and sticking on the topic of the New York Times, they've been in the news lately in media circles. You've seen James Bennett, the head of the editorial section. He had to leave after, he resigned after an op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton. And then last week you had Barry Weiss also resign. What do you make of the current status of the New York Times? And you left there 7 years ago now.
Yeah, I think departures and controversies and scandals get attention, but they risk overlooking the truth of the New York Times, which is this massive news machine that reports hundreds of stories a day accurately and sets the news agenda. And I think that's the big story of the New York Times. And then there is a sidebar story, which is these growing pains, these tensions between news and opinion, these tensions inside the opinion division about what the Times should stand for and what it should represent and what opinions it should include in its coverage. And that's all really interesting, but I think what's more important to say is, the Times is crushing it business-wise.
I think over 6 million subscribers now.
Yeah, it's what every other paper wants to be right now. And people like me who worked there 10 years ago were very skeptical of that subscription business model. I didn't want to be behind a paywall, but the Times found a way to do it, to let everybody still in a little bit, to gain subscribers, to give people reason to sign up and pay. And that's a huge accomplishment.
Yeah, and moving on with your career, in 2013, Howard Kurtz, who was then the host of Reliable Sources, left for Fox News. And then there was an opening there, and you eventually got the job. And you were at 28 years old. It was very incredible to have your own show on CNN at that time. How did you end up getting the job at Reliable Sources?
The network had on-air tryouts, which is pretty rare, not unheard of, but pretty rare. When Howie went to Fox, my wife, my now wife, who was just my girlfriend, she said to me, "Brian, they're going to call you. You're going to be the next host." And I laughed and I rolled my eyes. And then a week later, the head of talent at CNN called me and asked me to try out. So throughout the summer of 2013, when we were getting ready to get married, well, I was getting ready to propose, first of all. I hadn't proposed yet. Getting ready to propose, getting ready to settle down, I had these tryouts. So I tried out one day in DC, I tried out a second time, I tried out a third time. and a bunch of other folks did as well. And then in November, CNN settled on me and offered me the gig. What was really important to me was that this job not just be a Sunday television hosting job, which is absolutely the most visible part and the most important part. But it was important to me that I also be a full-time reporter. Um, Unlike Howie, who split his time between CNN and the Washington Post, this was going to be a full-time job at CNN, covering media for the website, covering media on TV during the week, and then also having a show on Sunday. And now I view it as a four-part job, like the four parts of the seat that I'm sitting on here. There's four legs of the seat. One is the Sunday show. Another one is writing stories for the website. Another is going on TV and talking about those stories and covering those stories on TV. And the fourth leg of the chair now is this newsletter I do at night. Oliver Darcy and I write this newsletter that's all about media at the end of the day. And to me, it's four legs of a chair that all help it stand up. Like if you only had three legs, it'd be wobbly. If you only had two legs, it wouldn't work. Having the show on Sunday helps me with sources for my stories during the week. Writing stories during the week gives me something to put in the newsletter. The newsletter readers give me ideas for the show on Sunday. So you know what I mean? It creates this beneficial kind of connection between each part of the job. And I know a lot of different people now in journalism have versions of this where they are writing, they are broadcasting. I really think it's important to have those different legs of the chair, whatever metaphor we want to use, rather than just doing one thing at a time.
Yeah, and I am a daily reader of the newsletter, and I would encourage everyone to sign up for that newsletter, especially if you're interested in media. I think it's a must read for those people. But getting back to the Sunday show, usually it's a recap of the top media headlines. How do you decide what ends up getting on the show?
Well, we should just be honest up front. There's 100 different stories you could do every week. So, and some weeks it feels like there's 200 stories, and I'm leaving things out that I'm desperate to include. But I think one rule of thumb for television is, you want it to keep moving, you want it to be fast paced, but you don't want to overstuff it. You don't want to overdo it, because then nothing really gets done well. If you try to do 20 things in an hour, you're not going to do any of them well. So, we try to narrow it down to about half a dozen stories that we think are really urgent. And that doesn't always mean, I guess I'm kind of adding caveats here. Like, I know that we leave out important stories, but my approach is basically this. CNN, you go to CNN in emergencies, you go to CNN during big events. CNN covers a few giant stories every day. Obviously, right now it's the pandemic. That's story number one. And so with that in mind, I want to cover the media angles and the media stories about those. I want to find the story behind the story, which is the catchphrase we use on the program to explain what we're doing. So with the pandemic, a media story about the pandemic is who's on TV talking about it? Can we trust those people? Where is Dr. Anthony Fauci? Why is Trump lying all the time about the pandemic? A media story about the pandemic is the data that we're getting from the CDC accurate and reliable? Is it complete? Like, finding those media stories is the challenge and the opportunity for our producers during the week.
Yeah, and I'm sure the show was very different in 2013 than it is now in the age of Donald Trump. How has the show changed since Donald Trump became president?
One thing has remained the same, and that is on my first program, I described my approach to the show. I said, reliable sources. Let's use that title to figure out what the show is about. Everything is a source now. Everybody is a source. Everyone is a source. So what is reliable? The question now is, what is reliable? And that was true in 2013. If you think about it, you have Facebook and Twitter and all these platforms, media companies, every company has become a media company because they're producing their own stories and their own podcasts and their own Twitter channels and all of that. Every nonprofit is a media outlet. Every person is a media outlet. You with your program right here. So that's blown up the world as we knew it 20 years ago. And I think it's incredibly confusing and exciting and thrilling and crazy for average news consumers. No one knows what to believe. So everyone's a source. What's reliable is still the main theme of the program. But what has changed, as you mentioned, is we're living through a crisis presidency. The leader of the free world wants to destroy news outlets, leads a hate movement against the media. And that is an overarching story that has to be addressed and continue to be covered and called out. I guess in 2013, 2014, I was able to have more time to do stories about journalism controversies, debates within newsrooms, which I'm still fascinated by. But when you've got a hate movement against the media and a raging pandemic, those sorts of issues are gonna come more front and center.
I want to move into more of a broader discussion about cable news, and I've watched a lot of it on all three of the major networks. And I would argue that when you watch cable news, you don't actually learn as much as you would if you watch like what are the network shows, if you watch the nightly news or morning show. And a lot of it is moved into more opinion-based shows. Um, would you agree with that assertion that you could probably learn more of what's going on in the news from either reading the newspaper or watching maybe the nightly news?
Well, I think it depends on what program you're talking about. I think cable news is too broad a brush for a conversation about like what the amount of content, the amount of information. There are some cable news shows that are almost purely entertainment, talk shows that only bring on one side, ranting and raving about made-up controversies. And of course, I'm talking about Fox when I say that. There are cable news shows that interview newsmakers and world
Do you
leaders.
think CNN does that too?
Well, what shows are you talking about?
I think at times you do have some very opinion-based shows at nighttime, like you do on Fox.
So which ones?
I would argue probably Como Prime Time, Don Lemon. I wouldn't say those are more new. I would say a lot of those are opinion-based shows. Would you agree?
I think those are newscasts that have opinionated voices on them. But I agree that these definitions of these terms sometimes feel outdated in a 2020 news environment. Like newscast versus opinion show. I don't know if that's necessarily the best divide to describe what's on cable TV these days. I'm not saying I have a better set of terms, but I think that there are a bunch of cable newscasts, news programs that are just newscasts. But then most of them are more in between, right? A typical hour during the day will have correspondents, but also analysts, which is more of a news analyst assessing what's going on. And then commentators, which is getting much more toward opinion. And then probably a politician or two, which clearly you're getting a partisan opinion from a politician. Yeah. And then maybe an advocacy group CEO or something, like clearly an opinion position, arguing for a point of view. And I think a typical hour probably has all of that or many of those aspects. So then what do you call that show? Well, I oftentimes say that cable news is really, it's best to think about it as a talk show about the news. Like meaning the 24/7 day of cable news, pick any channel, it's a rolling talk show about the news. And what I would say is on days when something terrible or wonderful is happening, a royal wedding or a mass shooting, you're gonna get raw, straight news coverage, right? Think about the times where it's just reporters for hours, no opinion, no commentators. And then other days when there's not as much urgently breaking, you're going to get a lot more commentators. You're going to get a lot more opinion or talk about the news. And I think that makes sense. That back and forth makes sense depending on what is a priority. Like right now, think about CNN in July of 2020. It is just like wall-to-wall doctors, nurses, health experts, pandemic coverage. That's exactly what we should be right now. By 10 or 11 p.m., you are going to get some opinion voices as well, trying to call out the Trump administration's failures. And that's totally appropriate in my view, because it's like a rolling talk show about the news. But then I think what happens is, to your point about, Cuomo, who brings on these big newsmakers, if you're booking newsmakers, if you're booking mayors or governors or senators, you're going to get a lot of opinion out of them. But I would argue that their opinions are also news. So then is it a newscast or an opinion show? That's what I mean. And let me add one more thought to that, which is, I think sometimes people think about when they say, oh, CNN has more point of view, CNN has more opinion now. They're talking about the monologues that the anchors are doing. Is that some of what you're referring to, like the essays that the anchors are doing?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the essays are like one of the big changes about CNN in the Trump years. And I think that they are a necessary addition to respond to all the lying and bullshit and indecency that's going on. Because think about it this way. If President Trump didn't lie for a week, if he just told the truth, tried to play it straight, focus on the pandemic, just didn't, there probably wouldn't be a lot of monologues and essays. I mean, there would be on other topics, but, I would not feel as compelled to start my show by saying he's in denial about the pandemic. And so the reason I start my show that way is I feel like I need to lay it out to the viewer and show them with sound bites and proof and evidence of what's wrong and what's going wrong. And I think sometimes the best way to do that is an essay or is a monologue. It's kind of like a newspaper column. I think about these monologues a lot like they're a newspaper column, like a Gail Collins or a Peggy Noonan or like it's the newspaper columnist tradition brought to TV. And by the way, you know who did it before anybody at CNN? Bill O'Reilly, Sean Hannity, like
Yes. Yep.
arguably they're borrowing from other Keith Olbermann, but personally, I think it's a good improvement because we are in an environment where you can't just sit there and be like, oh, well, today the president said the moon is blue. Like that is so irresponsible to just report what lie he said that day. I think it is so much more responsible and necessary for the anchors to say, he lied to you. Here's the proof. I'm going to tell you why he lied. I'm going to tell you how, that I think is the more appropriate response to this moment. But it comes across as point of view, right? But to a viewer like you, you're looking at that saying what? It's opinion?
I would say at times, yes. And I would say that both CNN, MSNBC, and Fox are guilty of this. But I also feel when you watch, if I was to watch a whole day of, say, a network like CNN and Fox News, I feel like there'd be a lot of big stories that are missed, some international things. And there's been a lot of focus on Donald Trump and what's going on in Washington. But there really is a lot more going on in the world. Do you think sometimes the media is guilty of missing out on some of these bigger stories?
But what do you mean by media? Again, I think it's about defining our terms. I think CNN's US channel on TV during the day is certainly pandemic focused and DC focused.
Yeah. But you can miss a lot of big stories.
But that's not how people consume the news anymore. So I would say CNN.com and CNN International are covering all of those other stories all around the world. And I would say the average news consumer is getting all of that online and not on TV. And I would argue that's a better format. Like in many ways, the internet is the superior distribution form for news. Yes, there's huge problems with disinformation and echo chambers and silos and all that shit, like huge problems. But the internet is an all-you-can-eat buffet, instantly updated all the time. It's a news lover's dream. TV is one story at a time, so I think the right answer is you do everything you can on the best platform. So you cover everything online. You cover the biggest stories on TV. To me, that's just like a logical play. And what I would suggest to you is, maybe it would be a better world if everyone paid attention to international stories and other big stories. The evidence for 50 years has showed that there's not a big American audience for that. Even when you give it to them, even when it's easy to get, there's not a lot of evidence there's a big audience for it. So thus, I think it's best that it is available online for people who want it.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree with that you could find all these big stories online. I think the issue is when you have some viewers that just watch cable news and they're missing out on a lot of their stories. But I want to get moving.
That person exists?
I would say so. I know some people that would exclusively just watch Fox News or just watch MSNBC, and I think they miss a lot of stories.
Well, there's a big problem with Fox in particular because that audience is told every day to hate the rest of the media. The Fox audience is told every day not to trust the rest of the media. So they are less likely to go and look at other outlets. I think the research shows, and I agree, I'm sure it's true for MSNBC and CNN to some degree, but I think the research shows that audiences for CNN and MSNBC are also consuming lots of websites and other outlets. They have a more of a varied, not balanced, but more of a varied news diet where you're consuming 12 different, sorts of outlets. I do think to the extent that it's a problem in news, it's an opportunity for innovation. It's an opportunity for young people to come up with better ways to deliver the news. Like right now, we're all just hot, we're all just addicted to the devices. We're addicted to our phones. We scroll through Facebook and Twitter. Let's come up with new ways to get people the news. Let's come up with new ways to get people a balanced diet of news. think there's just so much opportunity there for growth.
Yeah, and I want to talk about Fox News, which you've reported on a lot, and you have your new book coming out, Hoax, on August 25th. I think Fox is, if you watch it during the day, I think you will. It's very different than it is at night. I mean, I've watched a good share of Fox News, and during the day you will get a lot of that hard news, but you're also going to get a lot of opinion. And at night, of course, it changes when you have hosts like Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson. What do you make of Fox News in general, and as a media reporter, how do you view it?
I think Fox News is the biggest story on my beat. I think it's the most important story on the media beat. Um, it does not produce as much original reporting, of course, as the New York Times or CNN. So I don't want to sit here and say it's the most important news outlet in America, but I think it's the most important media outlet in America. And I'm making that distinction because a lot of the reasons why it's important are not related to the news. Sean Hannity is not a news anchor. He's a stop the news anchor. His job is to stop the news. He wants you to disbelieve the news. He wants you to dislike news outlets. But his power, his influence, it makes it a really important media outlet in the United States, the likes of which we've never seen before in our lifetimes or in the history of the United States. There's never been a merger like this between a network and a president. Maybe there never will be again. So that's why I wrote the book. The book comes out, as mentioned, in August. It's about 2015 to 2020, how Fox and Trump merged. And when I say merged, obviously not literally, obviously not every single person there. There are real journalists who are suffocating inside Fox, who want to be able to fact check the president, who want to be able to speak truth to power. But they're drowned out. They are squeezed out by sycophants like Hannity. So that's the tension, that's the drama inside Fox. And the pandemic this year is the latest example of the impact of it. You know, when you've got hosts and guests downplaying the virus, downplaying the severity of the pandemic, it did enormous harm in February and March. It may be doing harm right now. Hard to say for sure, but it may be doing harm again now. The shows on Fox are a lot more interested in inner city violence, urban violence, Portland, Seattle. They like to call out these cities. They're more interested in those stories than the pandemic, at least on Fox and Friends and Hannity. And that may be doing damage right now when it comes to the virus.
Yeah, and of course you do have some in Fox News that I would say are more coming at it from the center. You saw that interview with Chris Wallace, who I thought did an incredible job. He really pushed the president, which you usually don't see from a Fox News anchor. What were your thoughts watching that interview? I know it aired just before your show started.
Yeah, no, I watched the whole thing. At 9 a.m., we got the transcript for the interview, and then at 10 a.m., it aired in New York, so I could watch the whole thing before my show. And then we blew up half of my show in order to react to the interview, because it was a very important interview. It was the first time that the president had been challenged in months in a really meaningful way. You know, partly that's because the president was willing to have an hour-long sit-down with Chris Wallace. When you only get 10 or 15 minutes, the way most Trump interviewers do, even if you're a really dedicated journalist trying to really press the president, it's hard in that limited time, and when you're standing and when you're sweating, it's hard. And then you have a lot of presidential cheerleaders who interview the president who aren't trying to make news; they're trying just to help him, and so that's not really helpful for the public at large. But Chris Wallace got an hour, took advantage of the time, made the most of it. There were some questions that were a waste of time, things like why you tweet mean things about me, but most of it was relevant and useful. And you know, as CNN's Daniel Dale said, there could have been even more fact-checking. There could have been even more stopping the president saying, you're lying again, why are you lying? But Chris Wallace did do some of that and did it in a very nonchalant, just the facts way. And I think what Chris Wallace would say is, that's the way to handle it. Don't inject your own opinion, just ask questions. There was one question I liked. He said, that stood out to me. I'm trying to remember which one it was. I remember. Trump was going on a spiel about Joe Biden. He was exaggerating, trying to stoke fear about Democrats. And Trump said something like, they're going to take away religion, or you're going to lose religion. You're going to lose life. And we know what Trump means by that. What he means by that is Biden doesn't care about religion, which is not true, but that's what Trump says. And what Trump means by life is abortion. And Chris Wallace stopped him and said, do you mean abortion? And had Trump follow up. And then Wallace said, when you say religion, what do you mean by take away religion? What do you mean by lose religion? And I thought just that simple method of, what do you mean by that? that goes a long way with Trump, because a lot of times Trump is not talking. He's talking. Trump talks in different ways. We'd have to have a linguist on to explain it in detail. But like, I think sometimes those simple follow-ups, they are very effective because they force the president to explain the talking points that he repeats over and over again.
Yeah, and I think it would be interesting to see more interviews like that. I hope the president sits down with places such as CNN, NBC, and those types of places. Before we wrap up, I think if Donald Trump's going to leave, it's either going to be in January of next year. It's going to be 4 years after that. What do you think cable news is going to be like once he leaves? It feels like I've been following the news probably for the past 5 years, and it's been constant. Donald Trump, Donald Trump. What are they going to talk about after this?
Well, it's been constant Trump because he's the most important story.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any, I don't think anyone in cable news has to apologize for covering Donald Trump, as long as you're doing it in a fact-based, reality-based way. Maybe one day there'll be some apologies for the sycophantic coverage, the cheerleading coverage just does harm. But anyway, Trump is the biggest story. Trump is America. Like, when you say Trump, I think Trump is a great American argument about what our values are, what our morals are, what our future is. Like, what is this country? What does this country stand for? What is this country going to be? All of that is really Trump. So when we're talking about Trump, in my view, we are really talking about decency, values, family, America. Like, we're talking about those basics. He makes us go back to the basic building blocks. About racism and about sexism and about equality, like all class and inequality, like all of these things. Stories about Trump are really about those basic fibers of our being. So what's post-Trump look like? Well, first of all, there's going to be a lot of healing to do. There's going to be a lot of change. If a Democrat takes power in January or in 2025, there's going to be a lot of legislation. There's going to be a lot of change in government agencies. There's going to be a lot of news but from any Democratic administration. There's also going to be a fire, a Trump-fueled fire on the right that will be a big story. But I think, long term, your question is like, what is cable news, 5 or 10 years from now? It may, I don't know, it may revert back to what it was in 2013 and 2014, which is, kind of like right now with the pandemic. Health is the biggest story this year. Sometimes science is the biggest story. Sometimes aviation is the biggest story. Sometimes international conflicts are the biggest story. I think we go through these cycles in the news environment and in the television environment.
There definitely will not be a shortage of news, I can tell you that. Just the last couple of questions. What is your daily routine like? As you said, you have these 4 responsibilities. Like on an average day, what are you doing? I know it changes on the weekend from a day like today.
Every day is really different. And that's one thing I like about the job. People think I seem really busy. I try to look busy. I try to pretend to be busy. Yeah. I try to tweet all day.
Some scheduling of tweets there, I'm sure, right?
Schedule my tweets. So I'm tweeting overnight when I'm actually sleeping. But seriously, there's a few things that are predictable for me. One is that my 1-year-old kid's going to wake up at 5 a.m. and my 3-year-old's going to wake up at 6 a.m. So I'm up early with them. Another thing that's predictable is doing the newsletter at night. So I'm going to be busy in the evening. And then I can predict that on Sunday, I've got a show on Sunday morning. Other than that, it's all varied. So today, for example, on a Monday morning, I had a 6:30 a.m. live shot on New Day. I was just about to go to bed last night when the producer for New Day started blowing up my phone. He called me like 5 times because I didn't answer right away, and he was worried I was going to sleep. And he said he needed me for New Day, so 6:30 a.m. hit on New Day. Then we're working on buying a house, so I went out and I worked on the house for the day. Wrote a story for about half an hour during lunchtime, and then I'll work on the newsletter tonight. So, is that an 8-hour day? Is that a 6-hour day? Yesterday was a 12-hour day. Every day is different, and that's what I like about it. It's varied.
Yeah. And do you have any hobbies outside of journalism?
I do. I watch a lot of TV that's not TV news. I have some dorky hobbies. A lot of them are just about playing with my kids. A lot of it's about playing soccer and basketball with my 3-year-old, taking her to the park. I guess things I used to think of as hobbies, now those have been consumed by the kids, taking them to the park and things like that. But when I'm winding down, I'm watching Family Guy, I'm watching Rick and Morty, I'm playing games on my iPad, like little puzzle games, like little things like that to try to turn my brain off at the end of the day or the start of the day.
Yeah, and usually for every interview, I usually ask what your favorite pizza place is, and it's usually with a Connecticut guest who says either Sally's or Pepe's. Do you have a favorite pizza place? Have you been to Connecticut for pizza?
I have not been to any pizza place
Okay.
in Connecticut. I go, I guess Mystic Pizza's in Connecticut, right?
Yes, that is. Yeah.
Barely. Favorite pizza place. There are several right now. I could have pizza every day of the week and I'd be happy. My favorite slice in Manhattan is Upside Pizza, which is 39th and 8th. My favorite Mama's Two's on the Upper West Side for the Sicilian pepperoni slice, which is amazing. It's like way Upper West Side. And I think for just like a basic, thin crust pizza, um, Ruby Rosa, probably on Mulberry and Soho. This is one of the very few silver lines of the pandemic, which is that places like Ruby Rosa that you could not get a reservation at now just do carry out. So we've taken
Yeah, that is nice for me too. We have a lot of
Mhm.
good pizza here in Connecticut. We got B's, Sally's, and you're now able to get takeout from there, which is pretty nice.
We're the only.
And I want to finish up with right now. You mean you've been the anchor of Reliable Sources for almost 7 years now, and chief media correspondent. What do you see as your future to be? Do you want to move on to possibly be a news anchor on CNN in different hours?
I would do this job for 70 years if anybody will let me, and if my body will let me. I love this beat. I'm obsessed with this beat. It is great once in a while when there's breaking news to handle that during Reliable Sources. It's good to have the experience of anchoring general breaking news because I need to know what that's like. I need to know that experience. But I love this beat and I love covering media news. So I don't see it changing. I suppose the only asterisk I would add, if we're watching this in 10 years on YouTube, is I mentioned earlier when I launched TV Newser and I ran it, it was a hobby. It was just for fun. It wasn't a business. There's always going to be a little part of me in the back of my bald head that's going to wonder, could I do it again and make it into a business? And by the way, we're seeing people do that every day, launching paid newsletters, launching paid website. Like this is a huge trend now all across the media world. So it wouldn't be like I would be inventing any new business model or anything. But if I do that someday in the future, don't be surprised. But I don't know when because I'm having too much fun at CNN.
Well, Brian, that's a good place to wrap it up. I really want to thank you for joining me with your busy schedule. It really was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and you can catch Brian Stelter Sundays at 11 a.m. on Reliable Sources. I'd also encourage you to sign up for the newsletter, which is also called Reliable Sources. Thank you for watching. Reporting for Raving Ryan, I'm Ryan Anastasio.